The role of Hadith in Ikhtilāf among Muslim jurists. The Hadith which is Hasan on its own. There has been a dispute concerning the definition of the Hasan Hadith because it is a degree between Sahih and Da'if, and we see no point in discussing it. We have chosen the clearest and most renowned definitions. The Hasan Hadith is the Hadith whose chain of authorities is connected by transmission of Adal, whose accuracy is doubtful but is not incorrect or deficient. By that, it resembles the Sahih, except that its narrator is less accurate than the narrator of the Sahih. Hadith has been divided into Sahih and Da'if only, but when Al-Tirmidhi came, he praised the Hasan Hadith and renowned it, though the Hasan existed in the description of his teachers, such as Al-Bukhari, as well as those who came after him, such as Ad-Daraqutni and others. The Hasan is like the Sahih in its authority, and many of the scholars have included it under the Sahih, like Al-Hakim and Ibn Khuzaymah, and they made it into one category, considering their authority. The differences between them and the majority of the scholars does not mean suspension of the authority of the Hasan, but one can benefit from its classification when it contradicts the Sahih. There has been no disagreements upon the authority of the Hasan by any of the fuqaha or the traditionists. The Hadith which is Sahih due to another narration, and that which is Hasan due to another narration. A Hadith which is Sahih due to another narration is Hasan on its own if narrated in a different manner that it is like or stronger or an expression or sense. This strengthens it and elevates it to the Sahih degree, and thus it is named Sahih due to the other narration because the diminished accuracy in the Hasan Hadith was mended by numerous ways. A Hadith which is Hasan due to another narration is elevated to the degree of Hasan on its own through external strengthening. Originally it was Da'if, but became Hasan due to another narration because of another factor that caused its elevation. They have the same authority as the Sahih on its own and the Hasan on its own. The Mardud or rejected Hadith. It is the Hadith whose authority can not be accepted, and I shall discuss two of its kinds, the Da'if and the Mursal. Many scholars include the Mursal with the Da'if and consider it one of its kinds, and this is acceptable. But the Mursal has an advantage over the rest of this kinds of Hadith that are Da'if, and is used as authority by some scholars. There is a disagreement concerning it which caused conflict in many of the judicial ordinances. That is why I have singled it out from the other kinds of Da'if. The Da'if Hadith. Most of the scholars stated that a Da'if Hadith is that which does not have the qualifications of either the Sahih or the Hasan. It is more proper to say that it is that which does not have qualification of the Hasan, because what lacks the properties of the Hasan is farther from being Sahih or acceptable, and this definition is preferred by As-Sakhawi. The Da'if Hadith has many kinds according to the condition of soundness that they lack. Some have listed 42 kinds, while others have listed up to 360 kinds, and yet others have listed 510 kinds, most of which are abstract subdivisions which do not exist in reality. Some of these kinds have specific names such as Shadh, Mu'allal, Munqati', Munkar. The Da'if may be elevated to the degree of Hasan due to another narration, and thus becomes an authority and acceptable due to two rules. The first rule: if its chain of reporters were numerous, but this is not without qualification. Rather, Da'if must have the liability to be further strengthened. Thus, the reason for declaring it Da'if is the faulty memorization of the narrator and his negligence. As for that which made it weak by the narrator's corruption or his untruthfulness, its transmission by a different chain of reporters does not affect it. The first is referred to as a case of mended weakness, and the second of unmended weakness. Ahmed Shakir says that the unmended Da'if, if transmitted by other chains of reporters, remains Da'if and increases in weakness and not in authenticity, and can never be mended. The problem with the elevation of Da'if to Hasan, if it has been consolidated by other chains or reporters, is that this variety implies that the narrator very likely had mastered it even though he was accused of lack of accuracy and precision. Sheikh Abu Ghudda elaborates in his discussion on this matter, and one can refer to him for more. The second rule: the scholars must agree to its acceptance. Many scholars such as Ibn Abdul Bar, Ibn Hajar, As-Suyuti and others emphasize the question that is there any known limit to their agreement? Those that mention this rule and prove its soundness and truth do not mention any limits to it. But is it fair to say that? How do we know? Perhaps there are some scholars who disagree upon that, but that their disagreement is not known. In my opinion, it is not sufficient to collect all that has been said about a certain matter without any quotations. Sheikh Abu Ghudda has presented in his book an article regarding this rule by Hussein al-Ansari, in which occur some da'if hadith, but the scholars have agreed upon their acceptability and used them as proofs. But after further investigation, I found out that this was not so. Some of those hadith that did not have an acceptable isnad were claimed to be sahih by some of the scholars, and thus they were considered sahih. Others were subject to disagreement and were not agreed upon because of the controversy around them. Of these, I have chosen 3 hadith for illustration. The first, Ibn Abdul Bar says, the hadith, the sea and its water is pure and the flesh of its animals edible when dead, is sahih, even when some of the muhaddithun have regarded its isnad as da'if, because the majority of the ulama have accepted it, whereas Abu Ghudda, also an upholder of the rule under discussion, considers the isnad and the text of this hadith as sahih. Bukhari, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban consider this hadith sahih. It has also been mentioned in Al-Muwatta and narrated by the compilers of the Sunnah as well. Therefore, this hadith does serve as a good example for the rule of Ansari and others want to prove. The second, the hadith, no bequest for an heir, cannot be advanced to prove the rule under discussion. Shafi stated that this hadith is mutawatir. The fact that many other ulama have said the same thing. Zayla'i has filled 3 pages drawing a large list of the chain of its narrators. Kawthari in his maqalat has discussed this hadith in detail. This hadith therefore cannot be cited in proof of their claim. The third, he who is overcome by vomiting during the fast does not have to refast, and he who ever vomits deliberately must refast. This is collected by the 4 narrators of the Sunan. Al-Tirmidhi says it was transmitted in more than one narration on the authority of Abu Hurairah, and its chain of reporters is not sound, and the scholars have considered its authority. The reason for its weakness, Al-Tirmidhi has mentioned, is the singleness of Isa, who is one of its reporters. But Ahmed Shakir accuses Al-Tirmidhi of being wrong, and adds that this hadith has other chains of reporters, other than the one on the authority of Isa. This is why Al-Hakim made it sahih, according to the condition of Bukhari and Muslim. Al-Dhahabi agreed with him. Ahmed Shakir thus pulls the hadith out of its weakness and therefore substantiates the authority of the hadith in question. Thus it is clear that this rule needs more explanation, and the hadith which have been used to illustrate the validity of this rule are not free of contradiction. The authority of the da'if hadith and the controversy over it. The controversy amongst the scholars concerning the authority of the da'if may be summed up in 3 opinions. 1. It cannot be employed absolutely. 2. It can be employed without reservations. 3. It can be applied in ethics but not in jurisprudence under certain conditions. The third is the most popular, and it is the opinion of the majority. I shall discuss these 3 opinions and the arguments proposed by the scholars, and then I shall present their effects on the disagreements concerning the legal ordinances. Those who deny the authority of da'if absolutely, they are numerous, of whom I have mentioned Yahya bin Ma'in, Ibn Arabi and Ibn Hazm. It is also the opinion of Muslim, who in his introduction criticized those who have collected the da'if, and has a long discussion on the subject. Al-Bukhari is of the same opinion, and so are Ibn Abdul Salam and Ash-Shawkani. There are some contemporary scholars who supported this opinion, such as Ahmed Shakir, Ajaj, Al-Khatib, Subhi As-Salih, Al-Qasimi and Albani. Their argument is that there is no difference between ordinances and virtues, for prohibition and obligation cannot be proven except by a legal proof, and likewise the recommended and the not recommended cannot be proven except by it. Ash-Shawkani said, legal ordinances are equal in value, and there is no difference between them. They cannot be transmitted unless they have proof, otherwise that they will be attributing to God what he did not say. Ibn Taymiyyah says, it is not right to say that this is preferred or legitimate except for a legal proof, for no law can be proven by da'if hadith. Only Suyuti recognizes the authority of da'if absolutely. He says, da'if can also be used in ordinances if precaution is taken. This doctrine is false, for if it is accepted, the science of criticism and modification will lose its purpose, and there would be no use of scholars exerting themselves in clarifying da'if hadith and categorizing them so that others become familiar with them. Al-Laknawi comments on As-Suyuti's opinion saying, It is an absurd leniency. What is interesting is that Suyuti attributes this opinion to Ahmad ibn Hanbal and to Abu Dawood, while others like Athir and Turki agree with him. Athir adds 2 additions: first, that its weakness should not be extreme, and second, that it should only be in reference to the question. Turki mentions a third condition, that there should not be a companion's precedence in the same issue, because Ahmad ibn Hanbal prefers such precedence to the da'if hadith. But if one examines the statements of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, one finds out that they contradict and deny what has been said. He says, when we report on the authority of the Prophet, the legitimate and the illegitimate, the sunnahs and the ordinances, we must be strict, and when we report the virtues of deeds, we can be lenient. And in another quotation he states, the hadith concerning the spiritual development of man may be treated with leniency until we encounter hadith implying a law. The differentiation between virtues and ordinances is obvious in Ahmad's statement, which makes this opinion rejectable. Thus, Al-Kawthari says, whoever attributes to Ahmad ibn Hanbal the permissiveness in using da'if is mistaken. Ibn Taymiyyah states that whoever reports about Ahmad ibn Hanbal that which he has used the proof in weak hadith that is not Sahih or Hasan is mistaken. Then he shows that by using the da'if. Ahmad ibn Hanbal means that which is Hasan according to the latter scholars, because the hadith according to the early scholars was either Sahih or da'if, and that Al-Tirmidhi was the first to know of 3 kinds of hadith. It does not appear that what Ibn Taymiyyah mentions is true, because Hasan hadith was known before the time of Al-Tirmidhi, and he is the one who praised it and spread it. For Ibn Salah mentions in his introduction that Hasan occurred in the statements of the teachers of Tirmidhi and the class that preceded him, such as Hanbal and Bukhari. Awama dedicates a whole study to the cautioning against this. The error of saying that the Hasan was not known before the time of Tirmidhi thus, there is no point in mistaking the statement of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal about da'if for the Hasan. To reconcile these arguments and to reach a more sound conclusion, we can say that Hanbal allows da'if in the virtues of deeds only, and not in ordinances. This is the contradictory to what Suyuti and others have adopted. It is also bound by the conditions that they set, which are that its weakness should not be extreme, that it should not be the only hadith in question, and that the deed of the companion is not mentioned as a precedence. Al-Laknawi says, let it be known that those who called for accepting the da'if hadith concerning moral virtues are Ahmad ibn Hanbal and others. The majority recognize the validity of da'if in matters relating to fada'il. Nawawi even claims the consensus of the ulama for it. But how can there be a consensus when we already mentioned those who disagree upon this, such as Bukhari and Muslim? Those who support this opinion say the ordinances cannot be proven except by Sahih hadith. Istihbab, for example, is a legal ordinance, and in spite of that they still prove it by da'if. Therefore their statements are not free of confusion and their argument is weak. There are those who support this opinion, such as Nawawi, Ibn Abdul Barr, Khatib al-Baghdadi, Iraqi and Sakhawi, and many others. This permission is, to the majority of them, bound by 3 conditions. 1. That the weakness should not be extreme. 2. It should come in conformity to a general principle. 3. It should not be considered authentic, for one cannot attribute to the Prophet that which he did not say. This is in addition to the basic condition, which is, it is something that concerns moral virtues. They support the allowance for da'if by the fact that if the hadith is sahih in the same matter, then it has been fully employed, and if not, then nothing would have been caused by quoting it, such as tahleel and tahreem, or injustice to others. One responds to that by saying that the condition for using da'if is that which should not be attributed to the Prophet. Then how can istihbab, recommendation, and karahiyah, reprehension, be proven by it when both of them are legal ordinances that cannot be proved except by Sahih hadith? Those who claim disproving ordinances and virtues by da'if are more harmonious with one another than those who prove istihbab by da'if. They say that ahkam cannot be proven by da'if. We quoted Ibn Taymiyyah, who holds that it is not permitted to say this is a preferred or lawful except with an established legal proof. Ibn Humam proves istihbab on the basis of da'if hadith. Nawawi also proves the principle of karahiyah by da'if hadith. This shows in practice they went against the opinion of the majority, who did not recognize the validity of da'if hadith in matters related to ahkam. These precedents and others that have not been mentioned furnish us with enough ground to reject the opinion upheld by the majority. This difference in opinion had a certain impact on some of the legal ordinances, such as 1. Executing a Muslim for killing a dhimmi. The Hanafi sees no objection to quoting the hadith, "I am the best in keeping a covenant," said by the Prophet when he ordered the death of a Muslim who had killed a non-Muslim. The hadith is da'if, and that is why the majority do not accept it. They say that the Muslim ought not to be killed for killing a non-Muslim, using a sahih hadith that mentions a Muslim may not be killed for killing a kafir, narrated by Bukhari. Albani then proceeds to talk about two hadith and proves the weakness of the first. Notice here the Hanafis adopted da'if even though it is not on the virtues. 2. Permission of usury in a land of war. The Hanafis call for allowing usury for a Muslim in Dar al-Harb, and their proof is a da'if hadith. No dealing is considered usury in a warring country. Many oppose them on this because the absolute prohibition of usury does not specify any place, and because the hadith is da'if and cannot be used. Number 3. Wiping the neck during ablution. This is preferred by the Hanafis even if there is no hadith to prove it. They rely on da'if told by Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and that which An-Nawawi says is da'if by consensus. Then he mentions the opinions concerning the wiping of the neck, saying the fourth opinion is that it is neither sunnah nor mustahab, and the fourth opinion is the truth, and this is why Shafi does not even mention it. Nawawi, in rejecting this preference, mentions a hadith saying, "Every innovation is aberration," as if to say that the wiping the neck is not only not mustahab, but even an innovation.